Hi, everyone. Good day, and welcome to today's webinar titled ACRL's Benchmark Tool Using the Academic Library Trends and Statistics Survey for Peer Comparison, Advocacy, and Research. This will be presented today by Jeanette Pierce, Associate University Librarian for Research, Access, and Instructional Services at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Jeanette is a recent alumnus of the Association of Research Libraries Leadership Fellows Program. Co-presenter today is Devin Savage, Dean of Libraries for the Illinois Institute of Technology, where he's previously served in a variety of management and leadership roles over the last 8 years. He's currently the chair of the ACRL Academic Library Statistics and Trends Editorial Board and is the chair-elect for the Library Research Roundtable. I am Dr. Karen Kaufman and the current chair of the Library Research Roundtable. I'm a professor and research and instruction librarian at Seminole State College of Florida. The Library Research Roundtable is pleased to launch this year's webinar series, which focuses on collaborative research and how we can share resources, research methods, collaborative research experiences, and topics that broaden and contribute to our scholarship and the profession. This webinar intends to highlight new features of the ACRL benchmark tool, including how to access and use the data that may facilitate collaborative and deeper research. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items so you can know how to participate in today's event. Be sure to mute your microphones, but you can communicate using chat throughout the presentation. Also, if you have questions specific for the presenters at any time, you can also use the question and answer function of Zoom. And this will help keep questions organized and separate from the general chat. Jeanette and I will coordinate those questions for presenter during the question and answer segment at the end of the webinar. And so once again, we want to thank you all for joining, and I'm going to go ahead and mute my microphone and hand it over to Devin and Jeanette, and we're so pleased to have you.
Great, thanks so much. And first, there's a couple things I want to note before I get started and start sharing the slides. And one is that the call for Library Research Roundtable officers just went out. So if you want to nominate somebody or yourself, please take a look for that and come work with me in the next year. But the other quick thing I want to note is we have a couple of officers from ACRL here who work with Benchmark, Mary Jane Petrowski and Gina Parsons Diamond. And Mary Jane just noted that the chat is disabled because she's often able to weigh in on things in chat while me and Jeanette present our slides. So with that aside, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. So we're going to talk about ACRL's benchmark tool and how it may be used for peer comparison, advocacy, and research, of course. And I think one of the things is this theme for LRT is all about collaborative research, and this is one of the biggest collaborative projects that academic libraries have ever done, and not just because it's invitation goes out to every academic library, over half of them respond. It's also because there's a lot of collaboration between various professional organizations to refine this, to make this happen, to clarify things, and also the U.S. government agencies as well. This is just who we are really quick. We don't need to recap this, but here's our full sort of titles and roles on the Academic Library Trends and Statistics Editorial Board, which oversees the survey and the instrument. The brief history, I'm not going to read through all of this. I think it's just good for folks to know that this has been going on, these sort of activities have been going on a long time. In the 40s, there was kind of the need articulated for data gathering. And then in the 60s, sort of regular statistics collection started happening. In the 80s, you started seeing, the publishing of these statistics. And then in the 90s, there began to be this sort of more intentional, coordination with iPads, whether it was gathering statistics every other year, like in alternating years, and then slowly you can see going into the 2000s alignment with the iPads data. And most recently, the ACRL, late last year, ACRL benchmark, a new data gathering tool was launched. So the survey is very similar, but it's we have a new tool and a new way to engage with data. So, as many of you know, academic libraries are required to report to a lot of different places, not always every year or at the same time, but there's various, state and consortium requirements. Sometimes, disciplinary, like medical and legal academic libraries have their own surveys to respond to, as well as ARL, US News World Report, and of course, iPads and ACRL. And so we have really tried to align with the iPads academic library component, because it's the only survey required by all education institutions receiving federal funds. So what do we gather? Well, we have this sort of goal of having one survey, two data sets. So if you do our survey, then you automatically get the data for the iPads academic library component questions. So there's that. There's other questions that we've had historically, and we have tried to have a bias for inaction to make sure that longitudinal data carries through over time. But we've added new questions on top of that as well. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then there's the a whole separate component called trends that Jeanette's going to talk to you all a little bit about. And so the ACRL benchmark tool, and this is just kind of a shot of like the initial survey contact information, but it was launched, as I said, last year, took the place of ACRL metrics, which was provided by a third party, and now is managed in-house by ACRL. But it still has the storehouse of data that was gathered all the way back to 1998. So you can really identify trends and see kind of historical developments over time. And the data can get used in a variety of ways, and has been used in a variety of ways. Assessment, accreditation, peer comparison, annual reporting, planning and alignment, and importantly for this group, library and information science, disciplinary research studies. There's a really rich vein of data here that probably doesn't get used as often or as usefully as it could. But Jeanette is going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that you can do that.
Okay, so I am definitely coming at this more from the perspective of peer analysis and advocacy, but I will try to bring into some slides in my section talking about where I see the research potential in this data set as well. And really, I'll be looking at kind of three things: peer analysis, leveraging iPads, and also the trends survey with you. So I wanted to start with this slide because this has been one we've talked, this has been an example we've talked about through a number of presentations. And last year, my university librarian asked me to prepare something for our campus library committee that gave them a better understanding of where we stood as a library in terms of expenditures and staffing. So this was a great example of being able to use the ACRL data to have a conversation with them. And I think one of the big powers of Benchmark is the ability to create custom peer groups. So, but I also, it's important to think about who your peers are, whatever you're doing. So Mizzou's peers are the Association of American Universities, those AAU, the public institutions within that group. This is a very prestigious group of research libraries in our country. Our Association of Research Libraries colleagues, particularly again, our public institution, land-grant institution peers in that group. Within the Association of Research Libraries, they have some geographic breakdowns of North Central institutions. Some of our SEC peers at Mizzou are also ARL libraries. And then, of course, we need to look at Mizzou at libraries of similar student population size. Because we're not a University of Michigan or a University of Illinois in terms of our student population. We're much smaller than that. So it's sometimes fun to think we should compare to them, but it's not very reasonable. And we also but we are very comprehensive. So we have a medical school, a law school, a vet school, an ag school. So we have that comprehensiveness that we sometimes look to define peer groups. Obviously, we're Carnegie classification, very high research, and all of that as well. So I was able to prepare a presentation that looked across the types of information in the second column there. Our total library expenditures, our operating expenditures, expenditure trends, materials expenditures. Benchmark gave us some very nice ratio data, which you'll see a couple of examples of in the presentation, as well as staffing size and staffing ratios. And so these are the types of things that I really look for in the data that I want to share with you today. And it was a very useful presentation with our campus library committee. It helped them have conversations with us, with their colleagues on faculty council, and ultimately informed how they wanted to advocate for us with the provost office on our campus, which had a successful outcome this past year. We reversed some negative trends in our funding with the campus coming into this year. So I really think this has a powerful advocacy tool for many libraries. There, go ahead and go next, Devin. So we talked about the fact that you can create these peer groups. This is the screen that you'd see on most pages of Benchmark that shows how you can choose to see your statistical results by a Carnegie classification, including very detailed level Carnegie classifications, country, state. You do have to pick your survey year that you're looking at. And then the peer group name in the lower right-hand corner, there is where you are able to have preloaded your customized peer groups. So you create those under manage peer groups at the top. And I have about 5 peer groups that I keep regularly in there that I can just view the data through the different lenses of those different peer groups. And next. Okay, so this is where I'm going to be going with some of the examples, and we can go ahead and go next. So on the IPEDS data, the big benefit of the IPEDS data is looking at library data in relation to institutional data, such as graduation rates, retention rates, institutional expenditures for total expenditures or academic support expenditures. So this table just shows an example of library expenditures as a % of institutional expenditures for academic support. And when you're using Benchmark, the generated visualizations and tables will always show you your library in comparison to either a median or an average of whatever group you've selected to explore against, either all the libraries you report or a Carnegie group or a peer group that you've labeled there. So you can see that that we have a lower percentage at Mizzou in terms of the total percentage of expenditures from academic support there. And you can view how that has looked over time for that. And I think that's really interesting. Now, you can download the data itself and you can visualize that yourself in different ways. And then you can sort of visualize that without having to have your own library as the main visualization focus of the table. Go ahead, Devin. This is an example of the iPads data being brought in to look at a ratio of full FTE students to FTE librarians and how that can look against a group of peers, in this case, other doctoral institutions, in the case of my library. And they use the mean data for this table there, and go ahead. Oh, this one did not translate as well with the color background, so I apologize for that. We had more of a plain white background when we originally did this. But another thing that committee has discussed, and really want to thank Mary Jane for bringing this to our attention, was that we should really think about how the data can help inform how we can look at the standards for libraries in higher education. And so these are the different principles in the standards for libraries in higher education, which was last revised in 2018. It was designed to guide academic libraries in advancing and sustaining their role as partners in educating students and their institutional missions in the work of continuous improvement. And we really thought, it's like, well, let's look at how some of our metrics can support some of these standards. And Janine Kuntz and I, another member of the committee, did some very initial exploratory work in this in a 2021 article in CRL News, and would love others to engage with the data in this way and go a little deeper. Go ahead, Devin. So as you can see, this idea then informed how benchmark itself is framed, and you see some of these same principles. The data is presented using those as lenses within the benchmark tool. And go ahead. Okay, so just a few examples from the standards for libraries in higher education lens. There's a discovery principle, and each principles have performance indicators, usually multiple performance indicators. So one indicator for discovery is the library provides one-on-one assistance through multiple platforms to help users find information. And next. So of course, ACRL has long collected reference transaction data, and you can look at that over time within the tool. This table just shows 2020 data for all doctoral institutions, total number of transactions, total consultations, and virtual reference services, average numbers there. So it's a nice way, if you're looking at your own institution, to show how you're doing with providing this kind of service on your campus. Next. And then, of course, you can just download the data into your own table. You can track it over time. So here we can really start to see some trends in the profession with our transactions, with the total transactions really trending down. And you can see in 2020, what COVID may have really accelerated that kind of downward trend in transactions. Consultations, there's some questions what might be going on there, also seem to have some impact from COVID in trends, but maybe, we're still watching where that's going in the profession. And then virtual reference services, you can see a kind of steady trend upward there in the data. So this would be really interesting to dive into in more depth over a longer period of time and take a close look at that. Another indicator really looks at collections and how the library builds and ensures access to collections, including digital collections. And so one of the things Janine and I looked at with that was our institutional repositories. And you can go on, Devin. So this is just a table showing items in digital repositories across all libraries by Carnegie classification groups of doctoral, master's, baccalaureate, and associates. And you can see, particularly for doctoral institutions, a real growth in the amount of materials being made available through institutional repositories, also some growth in the master's institutions over time. And so that's a nice sort of trend data to be able to track as a profession. And then performance indicator for personnel, 8.1, library personnel are sufficient in quantity to meet the diverse teaching and research needs of faculty and students. Our profession doesn't have a lot of strong standards for this kind of question. So we rely a lot on that peer analysis to have an understanding of what might be a reasonable level of support in libraries. So go ahead and go to the next slide there. So for this, this was part of my campus library report, looking at a ratio of FTE students to FTE librarians. You know, how close are we to other institutions in terms of librarian availability to work with patrons on our campus? There. You can also look at total staffing. So I didn't put particular institution names here, but this is a range for a peer group, and you can see it's quite a big range. So no real standards in the profession, but certainly a great conversation point for your institution where you're sitting in that range, particularly if you're among the lower numbers there. What does that mean for what your library can do to support the campus work? That a management principle, the library allocates human and financial resources effectively and efficiently to advance the library's mission. Another, you know, how do we know we're allocating our human and financial resources effectively? Well, we have our service outputs, so we talk about those, but how do those, you know, what do they mean? Where's the context for those? And again, the context is our peers. So we can look at a couple of tables that look at this. One of the things I looked at is percentage of expenditure spent on staffing, because though we in the libraries here think we do not have enough staff, sometimes on campus they look and say, oh, you have a lot of people in the library. What do they all do when it's all online and on Google? So, so this shows sort of in comparison to our doctoral institution peers, with the blue being the University of Missouri, that we've been pretty on par with our colleagues in terms of our allocation towards staffing as a percentage of our budget, but that gap has been widening a bit in recent years, and it's not widening. We're certainly not widening in a way that suggests we're overstaffed. So that's an interesting type of table to use. And then this one looks at our subscriptions. All of our libraries are found we're putting more and more of our collections budgets towards subscriptions. This is a real great illustration of that from ACRL data. Over time, again, that time framework can be expanded for that. And you can see for a place like University of Missouri, we were fairly on par around 2015, a little closer to other institutions. And we've actually widened that gap a bit. We're spending more on subscriptions and less on owned purchased items like books than some of our peer institutions there. And this is just another example of that, looking at materials expenditures versus total library expenditures, which is one I was really looking at with my colleagues a couple of years ago, how as our budget's been changing, we've always managed to have a greater percentage on collections. But we may have reached a point where that's going to start shifting in 2021. I think that gap's going to be either really small or maybe even shift the other way, where we'll be spending slightly more on staffing and other library needs than on collections. But you can see that other institutions have been there for quite some time. Okay, so the trends questions are a really intriguing part of the ACRL survey, and something that's been really interesting to learn about as I've been on the committee for a few years. You can see this is a list. These trends questions are an additional set of questions to our standard ACRL questions. So most of our questions stay the same every year because we want to create that continual, data set over time. But the trends questions are different each year. They're usually a short set of questions. They're meant to be very low burden to respond to. And in some cases, they're not really statistical because we don't want people to have to gather information in order to be able to respond to them. So they're very much more sort of like, what are you doing and what is interesting you and how are things working in your library? And so they really give a nice snapshot, I think, of some things happening in the profession. The editorial board does determine the trends topic and questions each year. We use feedback from the survey to do this. We have discussions in the group of trends in the profession. And then we'll often reach out to another ACRL group to help vet the questions and the survey topic for that. So again, I think these provide some rich data sets to jump off to jumpstart some research, or maybe just go in depth in a particular topic. And go ahead and go to the next slide there. Elizabeth Brown and I, another member of the committee, again, tried to take some just basic exploratory look at the EDI trends data in a CNRL article. And so we found that while diversity, equity, and inclusion is such an important matter for our profession, that only 27% of the responding libraries in the trends indicated having formal written goals for EDI for that. And then within that group, our trends let us look at what were these goals that our libraries are having. And you can see those there in efforts 1 through 6. So it's a really interesting body of data that you can really dive into and explore. We also looked at how libraries are thinking about recruitment and retention as relates to EDI and all of those areas. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Devin. With that, it was interesting that we did that trends topic, and at the same time, a group in ALA was working on something that was published as the DEI scorecard for a library and information organization. And so after we sort of discovered this in process of looking at the trends data, Elizabeth and I, and so we looked at how well our data could help inform the scorecard. And that was very interesting because there was a lot that could inform the scorecard. But of course, if it had been intentionally developed together, it could be even better. So we were like, okay, this is a good opportunity for ALA because ACRL continues to prioritize EDI as one of our most important strategic areas. And so we can work as a committee, as an editorial committee, to maybe repeat this particular trends survey, perhaps on some sort of regular cycle, but also tie it more closely to the DEI scorecard and the other work of our organization as a whole, and really develop some over time deeper research data on this that reaches where we get the data from a lot of libraries. And that's the real value of the ACRL survey, is this large number of libraries that do respond and participate. So I was very excited about that. If this is an interest to you, we'd be happy to talk with folks about this and explore how we continue with this effort in the editorial board. And I think that is what I wanted to share today. We talked a lot about the peer groups, and a lot of the tables you saw, if they had the purple and the green, those were just visualizations created by Benchmark. But as I said, you can create your own tables and just download, and you can really dive into the data at a granular level. And that's in this report tab, where you can define your peer group and your year and go drill down into the questions of the survey and pull out and create your own data sets. So there's some sort of rich amount of data in there that could be explored different ways.
Yeah, and you can really see here, I mean, this is a nice visual because you can see, it's important to sort of measure by your state, your state peers. You can see very clearly there the SEC peers that Jeanette created. I created a group called AITU peers because I'm from an institution that's part of the Association of Independent Technological Universities, which does not look like any other university, usually not comprehensive, very STEM oriented. So it's a great example of the different kind of peers that we want to look at between like large public institutions and medium private or smaller liberal arts institutions. Like you can put those together yourself, and it's very, very helpful. So to move on, I'm going to talk about a case example which I used, which a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic, a university hired consultants to come in and look at all areas of the university and try to identify, where we could reshape the resources of the university and where they went. And they came to us with the idea that we were indeed overstaffed relative to our peers, to which I my first question was like, oh, who are you looking at and why? And then figuring out like what was wrong with the peer group data identified for us. So I went through this whole process that Jeanette just talked about of, going through and choosing the sort of parameters that you wanted in terms of, locations, what sort of data, the individual questions. The questions of the survey are all mapped as, numbers, and you can go through and figure out, which ones are expenditures, the holdings, the services. But one thing to be cognizant of is not all institutions submit, especially every year. Sometimes, really, perfect peer institutions or even aspirational peer institutions might submit, 3 years out of 4, but a particular year may not be included in there. So it's good to get a broad group. So for my example, I picked 8 different institutions. 5 had all the data for all the time, but I was able to go in and, look at the peer group and say, all right, compared to the peers that are, somewhere around us, both slightly bigger and slightly lower, it's true we spend about, a little less than 4% more on salary. And certainly part of that was, I think, also because we had a law school and other AIT institutions often don't. But if we are spending significantly less, 13% less on materials, but for that additional 4% on salary, you're getting a big, like we do 16% more presentations and 16% higher gate count. And so the programming and presentations and students actually being, using our spaces, these are all things that, equate to student engagement. These are, actual, engagement of the students, which is clearly correlates with retention as well. So like we are engaged in student retention and engagement initiatives for just that small amount of money. And, I would argue that's very much worth it. And it was being able to go into this sort of data, initially iPad's data, but Benchmark makes it very easy to go in and use instead of having to go and look up each individual institution's report in iPads. Benchmark makes this extremely easy to go and gather and use. It's really helpful in terms of crafting, getting the evidence to craft an argument, to craft a story when you need to. So that's my quick benchmarking example. One of the things I love in any sort of data warehouse that I look at is, can we export the data? Can I just get that data in an Excel sheet or a CSV file or whatever? These visualizations are great, as Jeanette has been showing, but when you go for each one of these little boxes of summaries or expenditures, if you go up where the little dots are in the corner and opposite click on that, then you can see where you can export data very clearly. And you can also sort axes and other kind of neat things. So in terms of accessing the data, I mean, the first thing I would say is that anyone who submits the survey gets an initial gets that initial sort of top line view of the data. You get to you get a sort of look at where you are versus your Carnegie class. To get that sort of data that where you're sorting peer groups and going in and pulling out the data like that, there is a subscription fee for ACRL to maintain. It is, in my experience, a very reasonable fee that you pay, but it is the sort of publication fee for getting the data, but it is very helpful. We provide a lot of resources here. I think this is, we have a live guide in addition to the resources page on Library Benchmark with the instructions, the ACRL live guide on Benchmark and the editorial board gives this sort of gives the sort of overall view to anybody, even if you're not entering into the benchmark site. And then there's so this is that sort of top line view that you get overall. But I wanted to say, like, there are actually some good examples that I found of where library scholars have used the data for research and statistical studies. John Budd looked at an examination of trends, pulling this data a number of years ago. Crawford study tried to look at the academic library and student retention and graduation, and sort of tracing correlations there. Rawls in 2015, and I think I actually saw him do this at the Library Assessment Conference in 2014, did a really neat study correlating research productivity and electronic library expenditures. And there was some really interesting correlations there. And then Schweider and Hinchliffe used some of these IPEDS and ACRL data sets along with other big data sets and an exploration of like kind of all the big data pieces kind of together and what they could find, which was also really interesting. So another thing I'll mention is if you are doing this data and you find that you've something was incorrect, you can indeed correct historical data. And many thanks to the ACRL folks, Mary Jane and Gina, for making this possible. But you can just email acrlbenchmark@ala.org to correct the data. The editorial board itself, which Jeanette and I are currently pulling together. You can, I won't recap the whole roster and mission charge and all this. You can go to the ALA site, the ACRL site, to read all that. But I think the basic things that, what we do in terms of maintaining and updating the survey is, reviewing and refining questions and guidance. Year after year, this group looks at questions, thinks, okay, I think we've made this clear enough, and then find that no, this is still confusing somehow. How do we do better? So that is going to be an eternal struggle going forward. But also, things outside the survey change. The way that people think about things and report things change as well. Create and define the trends questions. Identifying non-respondents and reaching out to encourage participation, especially over the years, we try to identify types of schools that don't respond very much and see how we can reach out and help them to participate. We liaise with appropriate groups, ARL, IPEDS, trying to coordinate what we're asking and what makes sense, and providing rapid response assistance. So when people have questions, we try to get back to them as quickly as possible. Now, there is, of course, caveats about any large data set. Of course, we mentioned that the subscription is needed for full functionality. But also, if you're trying to get a really large data set, sometimes you need to pull it year by year, or you need to work directly with ACRL if you're trying to do some deeper work. But there's also just it's easy to get hung up on what I call the futility of human endeavor. That individual data points can just be problematic. You might know that, your particular data points are, not really accurate, but I think that the overall amount of data over time, provides us insights into trends. Like, we may not know the exact number of, books that were useful to our stakeholders in some way, but some of the things that we gather can help point us to the truth. And here's some examples of some of the challenges on the individual questions. Virtual reference versus reference transaction has long been this sort of overlapping thing. I think it became a lot more clear to people during the lockdown and COVID pandemic, like, oh, okay, yeah, we're doing these activities here and we count some of these as because they're virtual, and the important things that we're gathering virtual interactions, but we also want to know what sort of, overall to reference transactions and overall research consultations. So you're gathering different data points and reporting them in a sort of Venn diagram. The electronic usage and circulation has become really interesting lately. That's a thing with the new Counter 5 standards, especially. One of the things that became really clear to me recently was the standard that used to be JR1 in Counter 4, and now we're using TR_J1. The new standard that we use actually strips out a lot of open access. And so while we want you to be able to talk about the things that you provide access to through your catalog, I think it's a really good move overall, because what we had seen is lots of vendors adding open access material to the packages that they would provide. So stuff that was not being paid for, and they weren't really producing in any way. They were just kind of adding it to make the overall cost usage of that package look better. And so this actually gives you a clearer view of that, so those sort of cost use numbers. And asynchronous presentations are one that really we added right before the pandemic. And I think it was really great that we did that because, especially as the way that presentations and programming started happening over the next year in hybrid formats and those sort of things, I think providing that opportunity for people to understand kind of the patterns of activity there was really important. But there's still a number of outstanding questions. So we are going to continue to think about this and evaluate what we're gathering and why. One of the big things is we don't really count views or usage. We're just asking for kind of attendance and the number of programs that people put together. There's some demand for that, but there's also some fuzziness if we were to start doing that. So we're thinking through that kind of carefully at this point. But I really encourage everybody to reach out and contact us if you think of some question after the session that you didn't ask. Please just reach out one-on-one. We're happy to be helpful in whatever way we can. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
While you're thinking about questions, I'll just add to Devin that each year we look for new members and we like to have a membership on the editorial board that represents different types of libraries in the academic library landscape. Always particularly looking for those community college library representation, also different types of skill and knowledge expertise, public services, collections, repositories, just having those different expertise voices in the room is really helpful. Love to have, a mix of more practitioners like myself and researchers who are maybe thinking about the data a little bit differently. So if there's something that interests you, just watch out for those calls for volunteers for ACRL committee.
Yeah, so I don't see any questions yet coming up in chat or the Q&A line, but I have a few. First of all, just really fascinating work. And I love the trends. I love the trends questions in that section because we're information professionals, and the information ecology is always changing. And in the academic library field, we see that, I think, very evidently, both in the way in which we interact within the academic library, but also with our colleagues across the institution. But that would also be true for public libraries and school librarians and academics teaching in LIS institutions, and the way in which they're preparing our future information professionals to sort of think about the trends and the way that we're working and instructing and providing services in those information ecologies. So first of all, I love that element of this tool. I think that's really, really innovative. I think it's entrepreneurial, which libraries haven't necessarily always been categorized that way, maybe identified as entrepreneurial, but I would suggest we are. So I love that. And then the second thing, and this is probably super basic and maybe I missed it. And I think, Devin, you mentioned this about the subscription, like who essentially has access to the data. And for example, at my institution, I know that we use it, but I didn't know we used it till I sort of had a conversation that was not specific about it. So how can we learn about that more specifically? And then I think there are a few chat questions, so I'll be quiet.
No, that's great. And that has been a, yeah, other people have raised the idea of, oh, I had no idea we had a subscription to this. And, now I need to find out, who in my institution has the access and how do I access it to do research? And that's a great question about how we can make that more visible. I think that's something, I'm not sure if we can do something to help make that more apparent about, which institutions do currently subscribe, because maybe there's something we can do there. But I also wanted to comment though on the, when you're talking about the trends, one thing we heard back on the DEI survey, but it's happened other times too, that by putting that survey out there, people look at that and then think, that then like are able to take back to their institution, hey, other institutions are doing these 6 things, or these 8 things for DEI initiatives. We didn't even think these last 2 were possible. Could we just, so it's a way sometimes of sharing information and sharing opportunities to very broadly. So I think there's an exciting sort of active element in addition to like the agile element of data collection as well. But yes, I see that we have a couple of
I just wanted to give one more comment on the who has access. So it's a single login for both completing the survey and using the data that you have. There is a level of data you have available to you just for completing the survey. And then if you're a subscription, you have that fuller level of data that we've been sharing today. And that is definitely something we've been discussing with ACRL as an editorial board, because right now, basically the person who submits the survey, they have to share that single login and password with whoever else in their library would like to access the data. And that's why it's more limited. It's not something you can easily just put up on a list and say, access it, because it's all password access right now. So if you're at your institution, you'd want to check with the person who's filling out the survey about access.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful to know, but I think, for example, I don't know, maybe, helping those folks who are doing the survey stuff to, remind them that, hey, you should let your staff know that we're, I don't know, in a whatever, however they do that in a librarian's meeting or a staff meeting, we're doing this. If you want to look at this data or access it, let me know if they're agreeable to that. And I understand at institutions there are different, limits, but just something to consider.
Yeah.
Great comments on that. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And we'll keep ACRL, I hope we'll keep looking as an organization about whether there's other ways we can provide that subscription access.
Yeah.
It's a little easier for folks.
Yeah. And I want to get to Carrie Weaver's question, who asked it just a few minutes ago, about asking about challenges of dealing with data metrics from openly published asynchronous learning objects and where they're being used by our campus community and by others around the world. Any thoughts or recommendations? And yeah, this is exactly one of the things that I was alluding to, and when we started asking about asynchronous presentations, and we also, have questions about, from the institutional repository and objects, being used there, and that there's some, so some different pieces around this. But what I have been, I think there's a lot of variety in what you're actually looking for. Some people are looking for, like how do we count things on YouTube or the Panopto or whatever sort of in-house video production that we're doing. Some people are looking for more static objects, modules built into LibGuides, or documents that people need to use before they come into class in the flipped learning environment, and those sort of things. And so I think I don't that without knowing the specifics, I can only give a more general philosophical answer, and that is it can be really useful to keep track of things that the ACRL survey doesn't necessarily ask about yet, and maybe something, if we find good use cases and ways to standardize that data gathering, it doesn't create a really increased burden on the staff who have to gather this data. Then those things often get added over time. Those are things that we it wasn't that long ago that we weren't gathering any data on research consultations, for example. That's the fairly recent past. So there are things that we start saying, wow, we're all like counting this and reporting it, but it's not getting recorded anywhere. That's the point where it's easier for us to start standardizing that sort of message. And
Yeah, do you see the question from Karen Harker?
Yeah, yep, I did. And I thought, and you would, and as Mary Jane notes, there's not IP authentication offered at this time. It would be, again, it would be great, but I think it's something. It's probably something to aspire to, being that Benchmark is an in-house product for ACRL. But I think that's certainly something to keep in mind as like a maybe a goal to work to, or something, and we can discuss if there's any sort of stopgap measures that we can do in the interim.
Yeah, I think also, given our current, once again, the trends environment of our information ecology is working towards more open access, open, data, research data being in the US anyway, more easily found and identified. And I know there are limitations. But I guess just keeping sort of that trend of ways in which, to share that information more broadly. Yes, the subscription currently is a model, and I understand why, and the intent of this tool initially, but I would suggest, for example, as a researcher practitioner, I can see great opportunity on that trends data to continue to do some other research that would be meaningful on multiple ways, that would both be beneficial to my own institution, but to our LAS community at large. And so that that's, I know we're all working towards that sort of new way of thinking about the way we manage, archive, share, and deliver information. But there's so many great visualizations, ways to, inside of this platform, work with very significant data that's really, to me, meaningful for ACRL, but institutions generally, and libraries. So I see great potential, and I'll be quiet now. I think there are a few more comments in the chat.
I didn't mention this. I had it as a note, though. The iPad's data does lag a little bit. They're slower to publish their data. So when you're using the feature that leverages the iPad's data, you're usually not getting the most current ACRL data. So you're getting maybe a couple of years back. ACRL, one of the things they've always done very well is we've gotten the data out very quickly after the survey. So there's a good year lag because we take a year collecting the data, but then once the data is collected, it comes out very, very quickly. So we often have very current data for ACRL. And right now we have the 2021, the fiscal year 2021 data is available in the survey.
I also want to highlight Mary Jane's comment that ACRL will be offering benchmark workshops at the ACRL conference in Pittsburgh in March. So we'll be, and I think we'll be there as well, talking more about benchmark. So if you're there, please take advantage of it. And of course, Mary Jane had a couple of good recommendations from Bob Duke, who is one of the great former figures of the of this group and other library statistics.
I wanted to add one comment about Carrie's that Devin already responded to, about Carrie's comment about asynchronous data, and going ahead and starting to figure out how your library can best collect data, what data you want to collect, how you use it, collect it. We have started doing that at the University of Missouri. So our librarians have the great pleasure of filling out both asynchronous and an asynchronous instruction statistics form. So the asynchronous, they're filling it out when they've created content for a course or a class there. And then we do try to go ahead and follow up and assess usage of our different content in there. So we are definitely experimenting with how we can collect that data and what data over time that we'll find useful to have at hand.
Yes, I can say, this is Karen again, that definition that you provided in that slide, distinguishing between virtual and reference, was really helpful. In fact, I'm going to go back and look at those slides and try to grab that content, because we too, Jeanette, are doing that at our institution. But I think that defining the definition that you've provided is really helpful for a consistent way to identify those distinctive opportunities. And from my perspective, as a researcher practitioner, having clearly defined methods that we are looking at to identify the ways in which we are reporting is super helpful. So back to the research mode. I appreciate that very much. So thank you for sharing. All right, we're down to 1 minute, so I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Great discussion, great presentation. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We'll post today's recording in the resources section of the LRRT website. just a note, please mark your calendar for the next webinar on December 16th. And the title of that is Rethinking Research as Collaboration in Action, presented by Vicki Terrell, Assistant Professor at Queensborough Community College, the City University of New York, part of the CUNY establishment, where she serves as the Public Services and Assessment Librarian and co-coordinator of information literacy. So look for that webinar announcement coming up. And finally, beyond our thank you to our presenters today, we want to acknowledge, honor, and thank our veterans on this Veterans Day. Thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone. Bye.